has become a problem.
No, sometimes it happens. I don't know, because that's fine, sir. Anyway, please, thank you.
So now I ask my intern Akriti to introduce today's guest.
Good evening, sir. My name is Akriti Verma. I am a student of International Relations and a Foreign Policy Research Institute intern. So, first of all, I welcome you. Mr. KVe Prasad, sir, is a senior journalist with 35 years in the profession, reporting on developments that figure across all sections in a newspaper. He has worked with the Press Trust of India, The Hindu, and the Tribune, where he was also its officiating editor. Currently, he is working as a columnist and freelance journalist. Besides reporting across various ministries, Prasad sir covered proceedings of both the Houses of Parliament for 25 years and served both as the chairman of Rajya Sabha Media Advisory Committee 2019 and 2020 and as the chairman of the Lok Sabha Press Gallery Committee in 2006. He was invited to serve on the Indian Parliamentary Group panel of parliamentarians to select the Best Parliamentarian Award for the years 2010, 2011, and 2012. During 2007 and 8, Prasad sir was awarded the Fulbright American Political Science Association Fellowship to work in the US Congress, pursuing role of US Congress in foreign policy. He remains the only journalist from India to have worked on Capitol Hill. In 2015, Prasad sir's contribution was recognized by Congressman Jim McDermott, in whose office he worked, and finds mention in the US Congressional Record. Besides contributing opinion pieces in various publications, he is a commentator on national politics, foreign and strategic affairs on television as well as radio networks. He is also invited to speak to share experience with Defense and Media Institutes and served on the Fulbright Selection Board. With this, I welcome you on the behalf of Foreign Policy Research Institute. Over to you, Mahendra Gaur sir.
Thank you, Akriti, for having welcomed our today's guest. And on behalf of FPRC and Foreign Policy School, I welcome him and I thank him for having accepted our invite to address the participants. And I think the students will have a very useful session, and they will learn many things which are not known in public, and they can satisfy their queries by putting questions to the question hour session. So sir, now it's all yours, and you are the what should I say, you are the master of the show now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gaur, and thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts with budding professionals in the field of foreign policy and other areas which they wish to pursue as they go along in their life. I think I want to thank Akriti for that very nice introduction. The fact remains that foreign policy and media is always a very, very challenging kind of a thing. Of course, the role of media, as you appreciate, pervades in every section of our society. And having been a practitioner largely in the print medium, if I was to characterize it, but I have seen the transition in the world of media from a traditional dominant role of the print in the Indian society till about 1990s, when the advent of satellite television changed the way the narrative and discourse started taking place in the country and elsewhere in the world. And from that time till probably the turn of the century and little later, the television too gave way, so much so that now we are in the world of what then became the new media. And now, of course, everything is back and beyond. It's now social media, right? That pervades everybody's life on a day-to-day basis. That has also changed the way journalism itself is functioning, if I were to give you a broad overview. Because journalism, as I entered in 1985 in this profession, was far different in terms of its landscape, I just explained to you. And where we are now, at the time when I've formally ended my tenure with the Tribune, no longer associated with any organization, but I continue to write for various publications, as you mentioned. So the landscape has altered dramatically, if I were to put it. And today, the role of media itself is being looked at differently. But I'll come to that portion later, because what I'm going to tell you a broad overview. First and foremost, when I talk of media, and when I talk of media and the landscape in this country, in India in particular, if I were to give you, when I ask you traditionally, what do you think? What image would you conjure in your mind when I say media? You will say a television show, a news show, or a paper that you get every morning, and you would like to browse through, literally taking the. If you don't do it, probably somebody at your home, probably your father or some elderly in the family who has been brought up on that staple diet would probably do it. Whereas nowadays, that has changed to everything that we know around this world, right? Our world has been snuggled to this just a small instrument. And this is what changes the way media is. But if I were to give you a broad understanding of the landscape, if you look at the websites or other things, you will find there is today in this country almost 1 lakh publications. When I say publications, dailies, weeklies, fortnightlies, and so on and so forth. They could be in different shapes, a full-size newspaper, or a tabloid, or a magazine, or a brochure, or so on and so forth. When I say 1 lakh, about 1 lakh figure, I give this figure from the Registrar of Newspapers of India, which comes under the Information Broadcasting Ministry, and it is responsible for registering every newspaper, or rather every publication in this country. So that's a legal requirement, so they kind of know. If you move away from there, you come to the electronic medium. Now, electronic medium in this country existed even before probably the country got independence in the terms, but actually when the country turned independent around 47, 48, then what we hear, the traditional electronic medium was the All India Radio, which would give you the voice, what became the wireless systems. And probably in 1959, the country actually experimented with television. So television and radio was largely confined to the sectors which were governed by the Government of India and its Ministry of Information Broadcasting. But as I just mentioned, a great leap happened around 1990 with the liberalization process coming in and satellite technology coming in. And today in this country, we have something like 900 television channels. And of the 900 television channels, almost half of them have a news bulletin. A news bulletin at the periodic intervals. It could be 6 hours, it could be 4 hours, it could be an hourly bulletin or round the clock. That's what the area. Now, new media is the convergence of these two, because you have the print, you have the voice, I mentioned, and the what has now become known to all of you as podcast, right? And you have the traditional print, which is in a printed format. You read an article. Then you come to video content, which is posted on the website. So these new media platforms have proliferated. And then comes today's scenario of what we call as social media. Some of you may be interested that last year in February, the government gave some figures which would actually tell you the kind of spread. One, because we all know the way which internet is penetrating in this country, and it is going to grow as we go along, because Digital India campaign goes at a faster clip. But if I were to give you a figure with the Government of India released in February of 2021, this country has 53 crores of WhatsApp users. Now, all of you know that means if you really count in terms of numbers, almost 40% of population, right? Then about 448 lakhs or 44.8 crores of YouTube users. You have 41 crores of Facebook, about 21 crores of Insta, and about 1.75 of Twitter. There could be many others, Reddit and so on, and I'm not going into some of the younger generations which are using, and probably Koo and other apps which have come into place. So this gives you a fairly reasonable example when you talk about media landscape. So this is a huge canvas, and here I'm not even talking in terms of, when you talk of foreign policies, number of foreign publications which have, or foreign media houses which have a correspondent or a stringer based in India, who report events out of India or in the Southeast Asia or Asia, depending on the geographical coverage they wish to beam to their own, to their subscribers and to their readers. So that being the landscape, what happens? How does a policymaker look at you? As I mentioned, media and foreign policy is a very, very distinct area, a niche area, as we always look at. And traditionally in this country, the foreign policy is largely driven by the Prime Minister and Prime Minister's office. This has been traditionally so. You must have heard this from many of the other people who have come and spoken to you in this course. From the time of the first Prime Minister, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, till Mr. Narendra Modi, we have a series of prime ministers who actually guide the foreign policy. Some have their own understanding, have brought their own value judgment to it. For a long time, Pandit Nehru was the man who was carrying the foreign policy, and of course, evolving the structures in place which help the country build up its own foreign policy and exponent people who are experts and who develop their own strategy and thinking and the processes forward. There's a long history in this country of foreign policy. In fact, it started even before the country became independent, because it shaping the world order, and the world order shaping India's thinking. There are umpteen studies. I don't want to get into it, but just restricting into the studies. So when I look at, as I told you, that there is a traditional format of media and interaction with foreign policy. Of course, I'm not going to get into this of what is foreign policy. You all understand the policy a country follows vis-a-vis its understanding of its conduct of relations with other countries in the world. And that is largely driven by your own national interest. And today, the mool mantra of foreign policy is strategic autonomy. You must have heard it in this course. Some other speakers might have spoken about it. Today, that's the basic guiding lodestar of our guiding signal for the country's foreign policy. But as I mentioned, foreign policy is largely driven by national interests. What is an interest of India converts itself into a policy that India has with other countries in the world. Just to take a small issue, Indian Constitution does allow, there is no distinction, I might say, for journalists. There is nothing that in Indian Constitution gives a journalist as a separate category. There is nothing in Indian Constitution which says there is a freedom of a press has to be treated separately. Unlike the American Constitution, where there's a specific amendment which guarantees the freedom of the press, there was a debate in Indian Constituent Assembly, and in, I think, around 1948, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar cleansed the issue, and he said that any ordinary citizen expressing a view is equivalent, and the members of the press do not enjoy any special status. That having been said, so all of us are citizens, all of us are journalists in the way. And if why I say so, all of us discuss it when you go back home, or probably where you are at home nowadays, say in a WhatsApp. It's very natural for you to have a conversation at home and say, you know what happened today in my college, in my office, in my school, in my classroom. What are we doing? We're actually reporting. We're actually conveying what happened. And that's what a journalist does all the time, except that there are certain things that the filters that we get in to kind of refine what we say and present it in a cogent manner so that it is understood by people, A, who don't know anything about it, or experts who know much about it. So we need to straddle and ensure that while the experts get what they want in terms of nuances in a foreign policy, for a layman, for a layperson, the layperson understands what is it all about. You don't make it too difficult for anybody to understand, or don't make it. So that's a rule for all journalistic attempts, not just foreign policy. But in case of foreign policy, it is more so, because people on a daily basis do not necessarily follow what's happening in other countries, largely because we are affected by what we are in the surrounds, in our own neighborhood, our own city, our own state, our own municipality, our own country, because that affects us day-to-day life. But suddenly, if you remember, when Russia attacked Ukraine, I'm sure many of you would have had these questions at home from somebody who said, "Ye kya ho raha hai? Why is Russia attacking Ukraine? What is the reason behind it?" And that's where the media plays a role in explaining and decoding, or trying to make you understand, when I mean a person, an average person understand, or an ordinary person understand what is happening around it. And why were Indians interested? A, it was a war. B, it was a war with Russia. C, Ukraine, many people had heard of it. Four most important, 20,000 Indian students in Ukraine, right? suddenly that figure starts ringing the bell. You had an uncle's cousin or a distant friend, or you had somebody of you who knew was studying in that country and has got stuck. So there is a foreign policy connect, which otherwise would not have rung your bell. Suddenly, most people in this country are interested to know what's happening in Ukraine. Why is Russia attacking? And then comes the other issue which goes with it. Is Russia right or wrong? Is Ukraine right or wrong? There are two sets of narratives that people would engage themselves into. So here you try to bear it down to what exactly the two sides are looking at. Try and understand, and then look at the larger strategic issues that are at play. I'll go into this kind of a specific situation maybe in the question answer session if it helps. I just gave an example to make you understand the nuances of foreign policy change differently at different times. How do you, as a media, try to interact with the audience or the reader or the listener and try and reach out to them to make them understand? So I said, what are the traditional formats in which there is a foreign policy conduct, as I would say. Countries do it. They do it through the traditional, as I said, the print medium. They have, in the print, you have pamphlets, brochures, study material, books, campaign material, literacy, and so on and so forth. The countries do engage all the time, position papers and so on. Then you have, of course, as I said, the electronic media, where you have conversations with people who understand these nuances, who try to decode it for you and make it sound and cognizable and understandable, not cognizable, make it understandable in a language that it kind of narrates to you where we are, right? So then, of course, as I said, the news media and stuff. So there is an essential difference when I look at it as a practitioner today. Unlike the regulated formats that we've had in this country in terms of a newspaper industry or the newspaper publications, the radio channels and the radio televisions and the new media, news media, which works in the new media platforms. Today, as I said, you have social media. So everybody is a journalist, as I mentioned. And so there is no control. When I say control, there is no inlet and outlet. In the sense, in a traditional format, a newspaper reporter would file a copy to his news desk. A news desk would read it and try and make sense out of it. And then once the news desk is satisfied that the correspondence copy is fairly understandable and legible and makes sense, then it is released for publication. So there is a gatekeeper. Similarly, there is a gatekeeper for television, radio, new media. But now in social media, these things are different. What we saw from Ukraine, right? Children sending you messages across WhatsApp applications, YouTube, Twitter. So it was only a platform, right? So people stuck in difficult situations were using this platform to communicate to the policymakers at home. So the policymakers have now to react differently, because earlier it would take a little bit of time probably. In earlier times, we could see what you might have read stories about the Gulf War and the evacuations during the 91 Gulf War and earlier times. The problems would be communicated to, say, a friend in Delhi or whatever city you're there, and that friend or that person or your family would try and reach out to somebody in the media and say, look, we are getting this problem, or reach out to the member of parliament or somebody in office of authority to try and help you out. So now those channels have evaporated, if I would say, or have blurred. So it is going directly. So this is the churn that is happening, which puts intense pressure on the policy planners who have to react in real-time situations. Because you are seeing a visual coming out from a conflict zone, and your country people are stuck there, are suffering or having issues. So they appeal for help. So there is an emotional pull. There is there's a lot of churn happening. So governments will have to act at real-time basis. So as I said, from the regulated and organized sectors, it has moved. The structures have moved differently. Of course, in the regulated format, you also had the established means of communication through various news outlets, as I mentioned. You had the government communicating back and forth through these channels. You had the advocacy groups who are in interaction with the authorities concerned. You had think tanks on a different plane. You had universities and colleges where you had, now with this, all this is gone. So this kind of situation leads you a different situation. The policy now, what does this all do? Does media influence the public opinion? It surely does. Now, as I said, now those traditional system earlier on, some of these people who had understanding or had an appreciation would write and communicate to people at large that look what's happening. Today, as I said, what we saw, what happened in the case of Ukraine, it certainly changes the narrative for the government of the day. The government comes and has to attend to the problem. It would have attended in any case. I'm not saying they would have delayed it, but what I meant was the immediacy goes up as much faster than it would have normally taken a little more time to organize. How do you react to it? How do you play? How do you deal with the situation? So a lot of crisis management takes place at that point of time. So this is where you look at. So if you look at foreign policy as such, people say it's a domain of experts. That's been largely a system. And of course, it's a domain of experts because there is, since most of you are studying foreign policy, it's not a one size fits all. Clearly not. What is a policy towards in a neighborhood is different from what is a policy in the larger extended neighborhood. The strategic sphere of influences, what is our West Asia policy, what is the East Asia policy, what is the policy towards Europe, what is the policy of America, Latin America, so on and so forth. So these apply in different things. And there is an overall country's foreign policy, which I said is guided by our bigger mantra of strategic autonomy. And that you would have heard this conversation recently in the Ukraine issue and the debate that happened in the UN Security Council, where India decision not to abstain has had conversations going on around the subject. So the country has taken an informed decision, has decided to go with it. So there are sets of opinion arguing either way, whether you should do this policy A, policy B. That's perfectly fine. In a democratic setup, these kind of debates and discussions do happen and help formulate a policy as you go along. And this has happened from time immemorial, not just in the media. And when I say media, it obviously extends to what is reflected in the media, goes into discussions among members of parliament. So when parliament convenes, you hear these voices coming in on any issue. And if you look at the foreign policy debates that have happened since Constituent Assembly, members of parliament have been raising issues on the foreign policy, even though there are many shades, many areas which the parliament has a role, but there are certain executive decisions which is left to the government of the day, which, for instance, entering into a treaty. That's something that the government of the day has exclusive powers. It's in the domain of the executive. Parliament at times has still questioned that. I mean, for instance, it questioned during the World Trade Organization debate or the GATT debate, which happened. It happened during the Indo-US nuclear deal. Probably it did not happen much later, but there are times when people raise, when I say members of parliament do raise these issues as to what extent should parliament discuss, debate, not to what extent, the extent to which parliament can debate and discuss and try and tell the government what needs to be done. It's perfectly for the government of the day to take a view and take the conversation forward. We've seen many policy debates taking head around these issues. So the other networks that we look at, as I said, does the media and the conversations frame public opinion? Does media actually come up with the policy formulations where the government takes a view of it? Yes, they do take a view. Whether they take a view, it's a good input, right? And when I say media, developments which is happening on the ground, they find reflection. Then the policymakers do read about it, and there are strategic analysts, there are thinkers who write about these issues, bring out nuances, which academicians say, like Dr. Gore, if he writes a policy issue, somebody is bound to read that and say, hey, he has got something different to say. Okay, can we look at it? So that's how you set thinking, you set people thinking. Does it happen overnight? Does it change the policy overnight? That some empirical study will have to be done to kind of. I am not into that academic world of it. I'm just talking as a practitioner, has seen media and its policy and foreign policy connect. As I said, domain experts are there. Strategic thinkers who come up. Then some call it, it's an exclusive. Is it an elite-driven model? Is foreign policy an elite-driven model? And does media look at it? Well, that used to be probably used to be the case several years ago. because far and less people were actually studying foreign policy. There were fewer institutes allowing you to do it. They were there, right? Very prestigious universities in this country have had foreign policy courses, but probably the interest generation was different for whatever reason. Now you see increasingly people taking interest. Because we live in a far more interconnected world. So what happens in not necessarily just in the neighborhood, but in a far country which is 10,000 miles away from where we are, if something happens, does touch you. For instance, if something happens in America or Canada, we all may be having somebody we know there, right? Or you had some people in the Far East, say in down under in Australia or New Zealand or in Africa. Somebody has some connect there. So these start moving differently, the pieces start moving differently. Then I said the larger picture of foreign policy, that not larger picture, there is one element which we always read and always probably experience, is how governments come up with their own narrative, which sometimes is described as propaganda. But that's important because every government needs to put its point of view on the table for people, for the public to understand why it is being driven the way it is driven. For instance, this the entire war we are seeing, or the battle that's going on, there's more than one side to a story that's coming up, right? You see certain aspects, certain things which are being said by Russia, certain things by Ukraine, EU is saying something, NATO conversations happening between America is, so we read this different thing and try to see, is there a thread that connects to one or other, or how do you look at it? So media is analyzing this all the time for the benefit of for the larger public good, for the larger public good, and B, sometimes some of the policymakers may not find immediate time to go take a deep dive. So it helps them quickly analyze and give them a quick bullet points to understand, look, this is happening. This is what I read in such and such organization, or a reputed media columnist has written about it. So can we have more of it? Can we analyze this? Can we look into it? So this is how it conducted. Does it always say that whatever is written, government has to follow? No, not at all. There is an opinion. An opinion is expressed. Certain facts are given from the ground. And then the government has its own mechanism, its own inputs coming all the time, largely from its own establishment, foreign policy establishments, which means Indian diplomats who are working in various capitals of the world are all the time on the job to accumulate information and send it back home for processing. So all these are collated at a level of policymakers. Different strands of information coming from different sources. So media media, I would premise, provides an element of that information. That's something which is there. So policymakers, as I said, do take it as an input. How much of they want to take it is totally up to them. I mean, what would appeal to them, they would obviously take that into account. So the messaging has to come from the decision makers. What kind of messaging are we going to give? So these are something. Now, as I said, in social media, what has happened, because of the social media connect, everything is instant, it's real time, reaction time has come down to a large extent. You have to give a sound bite, or you have to give a video connect, or you need to quickly come up with the readout. So because people need to know what the government of India is to taking a position vis-a-vis, say, what's happening today in Ukraine, right? People want to understand. So this is something which you need to look at. Does media and its policy have the power to alter or change? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and sometimes midway. If I were to say, give you some analogy, there will be many instances where the kind of public pressure is built. Governments of the day are bound to look at it. And it's not that media is doing it, media is just conveying the message. Just as in case of Ukraine, the children conveyed the message. This platform was the medium which reached people home. All of you must have read or heard from, if not now, you may probably hear during the course Dr. Gaur would organize. We all heard how Sushma Swaraj, as the External Affairs Minister, made a extremely useful, put this to use to help Indians in distress. So use the social media so people used to reach her, and there was a very popular once, a very interesting tweet somebody had said that somebody is probably washing machine or refrigerator conged off and was not being attended to. So that person tagged to Sushma ji, and she said she has, I think probably she sympathized with that person, said, but I'm not the person who can help you in this case. So, you know, that's just a humorous side. The fact is people have now greater access, and that's why all countries, diplomats everywhere in the world are connecting you digitally. And the government of India, the Ministry of External Affairs has a separate division which handles this all the time, which was launched about a few years ago. Coming to that, there is a structure which probably you're aware. The structure in the Ministry of External Affairs is that we have an external publicity division. Now, this division was set up a year after the country became independent. I mean, it existed earlier, but around 48, it was transferred to come under the Ministry of External Affairs. So the external publicity division is responsible and tasked with the job of communicating India's position on various developments in the world. This could be suo moto statements. This could be statements from people in the ministry, or sometimes they're driven or responded to when media asks them a question all the time. And earlier there used to be a different format. You had a traditional press conference happening once in a way, so you could direct a question and you would get an answer. Way before, you had no option when we were living in the different age, telephones or something. So traditionally, if a journalist had a query, he would call up the external publicity division. There is a joint secretary in charge of external secretary, a ranking officer, to whom you submit your question and say, listen, this is a specific query I'm looking at. Can you get me the answer? So it would take time and come back. But nowadays, as I said, all this has changed. It has changed so dramatically. People shoot a question on email. People send a query on WhatsApp. People send a query on Twitter from anywhere in the world and directly to the person concerned, who is tasked with the job of. So the job, as I said, has changed, has undergone a transformation. But the traditional modes also continue. Even today, we have a weekly press briefing by the Ministry of External Affairs External Publicity Division. Questions are taken, answers are given, and if there are no answers immediately, sometimes time is sought to say we'll get back to you or whatever. So these are very standard practices. One more. So in addition to that, somewhere in the year 2006, the government has started what is known as a public diplomacy division. A public diplomacy division, what does it do? It actually engages foreign policy practitioners, especially those who have been diplomats and have since superannuated or retired. They go around, speak on public issues, on policy issues, to various colleges, universities, think tanks, and many other places. So give you an understanding as to how India is working on its foreign policy. So this helps you to, on average, understand student or people who are interested in this realm, to understand how India is engaging with the world and how the world is engaging with India. So this is a constant communication, and now very important because, as I said, we all live in an interconnected world. So this happens ever so often. And if you look at the Ministry of External Affairs website, there is an entire public policy division link, and you can see series of lectures members of the diplomatic community are giving at various universities. If you go through those papers, it gives you a very good insight as to what kind of policy formulations are there, and gives you understanding of the nuances that happen in between. This is where some of the things, then of course, as I said, public diplomacy, then you have soft power diplomacy, or think tanks like the Indian Council for World Affairs, which is the official think tank of the government of India, set way back again in the early, late 50s. Then you have the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, which of course is probably, if I would characterize as a soft power, where Indian culture is taken, I mean, our dance, drama, other things are taken to various foreign countries, and people get to understand that. In addition to that, we also have what is called ITech, which is a scholarship where India allocates an X amount of scholarship to various continents and various countries, and their students come and pursue studies in various subjects of their interest in universities and other places of interest. So this is another area of soft power where India and Indian culture is people of foreign countries come here, study, and get understanding of these things. So then these are multiple layers that happen all the time. That's where I would say, and to put it shortly, it's a dynamic process. Let me put it this way: there's nothing that you say today and it ends. It's a policy, something which keeps on evolving. In foreign policy, what's important is you need to understand the nuances. Try and read very carefully, because every word is put very carefully. Every word has a meaning. In fact, I should tell you an interesting incident. I was once talking to our foreign late President Pranab Mukherjee ji, when he was held the foreign minister's post, and he relinquished that post, and they were sitting in opposition. I was just chatting, and there was a political decision that he had been engaged in. So I said, Mukherjee sir, I would like to understand what was most difficult for you to negotiating this political settlement within your party, or the draft you negotiated in the international organization. He thought over it and said, Prasad, sometimes to put a comma, it might take a whole night in international convention. We can discuss whether you need a comma or not then. So that, I mean, is the importance of that. And also, I remember another quote when a foreign minister told us once, it was published in our paper, The Hindu, at that point of time. I think Mr. Natarajan Singh was asked when he became the minister of this country, so what do you want to say? He said, a good diplomat thinks twice before saying nothing. So that tells you how much they think. They're very careful in choosing their words, because every word has its own implications. So as media and people of practitioners who understand, it's very important that you read every statement very, very carefully and try and understand what's said there. And if you don't understand, please feel free to talk to experts and say, can you decode it for me? Am I looking at it correctly? Say, if I were in proximity and if I understand Dr. Gore's expertise in an area of, say, X of foreign policy, I'd quickly give him a call and say, this is what the statement says, and this is what the previous statement said. I detect this. Is this a variance I'm correctly detecting, or am I missing something? So that helps you to make sure that your understanding is correct, it's cogent, and when you write it, you're not faulted for misinterpreting something which is as crystal clear otherwise to the people who have drafted it. So I think, Dr. Gore, I'll take a break here for a minute. Maybe we can start questions. I also need a water break. I think I'm muted. Sir, you're muted.
And the role of media in the formulation of Indian foreign policy is a subject which deserves attention in today's world, in an interconnected world. And I believe that there are four pillars of the formulation of Indian foreign policy: policymakers, the diplomats, the media persons who report it, and academics who analyze it. So all these four together make a complete, assessment of any event or any situation or any problem. And media has definitely played a very useful role in the formulation of Indian foreign policy. So now, before I proceed further, I will ask my students to put questions to you. Yes, please go on, be quick. Yes, come on. Don't wait. Come on.
I might add something here, sir. I might just add that something which you said also brings me to the thought that, you see, as I said, we've reported media and foreign policy, both in terms of our interaction with the Ministry of External Affairs and with members of parliament. I have watched some of the closest debates happening in this country on WTO, where members of parliament were constantly engaging with the government, trying to suggest how it's happening and what's happening. And it was a constant conversation happening, not just with members of parliament, but with the larger population of this country in the terms of think tanks, in the terms of policymakers, in the terms of advocacy groups. Different people had different questions, and all that got back and forth on a daily basis. That forms a huge material for the government and all for policy makers. Similarly, fast forward to the 2005-2007 Indo-US nuclear deal. Now that nuclear deal again was a very interesting conversation happening within the country on a subject which was again like WTO was technical, but it also reflected the strategic engagement that India was having with the United States of America, which was being resisted by a set of or a section which had grown up when India was close to the United USSR or the non-aligned world. So there one had to look at the formulation of foreign policy, how the country's foreign policy is making a transition from where India was in terms of non-alignment and the leader of non-alignment to its own independent foreign policy, where the bipolarity had gone in this world. So people had acknowledged that America remains a unipolar thing, and how the country was recalibrating its foreign policy. So media inputs also play, because when I say media, we report from the grounds. We also talk to experts, subject experts, who give you an opinion, which again is, as I said, goes back and forth. Something which my experience in the American Congress was something, because in America, the foreign policy is, of course, dictated by the US administration. But one of the things that American Congress tells is they have the control on foreign policy. In fact, one of the lines which the standard textbook tells us, the United States of America has 435 Secretaries of State. And when I say 435 Secretaries of State, means each member of the House of Representatives. And if you add the senators of 100, they have their own understanding of foreign policy, and they tell the government, look, you need to do this. And probably today, again, you're seeing this issue of whether India will get the sanctions on CATSA, the countering American adversaries through sanctions, which because of the acquisition of S-400 Triumph missile. Now, this is a conversation happening on the Capitol Hill. For a long time, there are some people who say, no, India should not be sanctioned because it's a strategic partner, and so on and so forth, because if you do it, India will be forced to go closer to Russia. So this conversation is happening on the Hill. So all this is something which media reports, and we report as it happens. So policymakers, on not just here, everywhere in the world, do read it. So I think that's where we try, and as you said, one of the 4 inputs. So one of the inputs, I said, policymakers do take it as an input coming to them. Thank you.
I did a question in the chat box, I think, for
Right.
you.
Yes, please. 1 second. Yeah, I see. That's right. Okay, how do you view the growth of social media with particular focus on foreign policy? How successful would be to create a discourse on issues concerning foreign policy, as the interest is quite limited? Absolutely. I mean, that's why I said, you see, this is a niche area. Foreign policy, as I said, doesn't interest everybody and anybody. As I gave you an example, most people would not have even, many people probably would not have been aware that the number of students studying in Ukraine, medical students, right? 20,000 is not a big number if you really look in terms of the country's student population and medical student population. But when you look at the issue in terms of the numbers who had to be transported from that war zone, it suddenly became an issue. Just as the Gulf War had a problem for the country to relocate probably more than a few lakh of Indian workforce there, because again, India provides the largest workforce who are working in the Gulf areas. And so this is something which you're right. Social media, again, as I said, the dynamics have changed. So if you actually open Twitter or Facebook, I mean, a lot of people are writing a lot of things. If it interests you, you have to pursue and read it. A lot of think tanks, not just in India, but in the world, generate papers. And those papers, if it interests you, are available on the websites. So if you read it, you will get a perspective. And it helps you to formulate an opinion on certain things, or have inputs so that you can have an understanding. Social media, when you say social media, so listen, somebody who has little understanding, let me say so. Okay, he's just heard about what's happening in Ukraine, and he or she goes and a totally different understanding comes and gives a statement or makes a opinion. How should it be taken? How should it's okay, it's an opinion, but it may not be exactly matching on the inputs that the policymakers have from the ground. So it's a very social media does influence, as I said, in this case you have seen, but to conduct foreign policy through any media for that matter, it doesn't happen that way on a day-to-day life. I hope I answer your question, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Be quick. She has thanked you. She has thanked you.
Oh, thank you, sir. Wonderful. Yeah, I saw that. Thank you. You see, foreign policy, of course, is a something which is it's a vast subject. So you specialize in certain areas, you go deep, you get even deeper. Like, I mean, I follow the US policy for a long time, but that's because I've been there, so I have understanding. But other areas you look at times required. As a journalist, you're required to look at it all the time, because suddenly, as I said, there's a crisis in Ukraine, we suddenly have to focus on Ukraine and report about Ukraine. So you need to quickly do quick studies and get back. Suppose tomorrow something else happens, you have to quickly shift your focus to that area and try and see. But policy constructs are not doesn't happen overnight. You see, they are well thought out. Their implications, they're all round. You take an all-round view as to what you do. What if you take a particular step? How is it going to impact your relationship vis-a-vis other countries, vis-a-vis your own country? Are there pulls and pressures within your own country on a particular issue? For instance, for a long time, India had this policy of, if you know, in the West Asia, Israel and Palestine, right? But that policy was, for some time ago, was dehyphenated. So India now doesn't, it's a standalone policy. So these are issues that keep changing and changing on the understanding of the geopolitical situation and the geostrategic situation that keep emerging. And today, the whole world is now looking at what you know as the Indo-Pacific, right? That's a big area of study. Almost all countries are devoting their energies and effort to understand what Indo-Pacific is. In between has come Quad, then come the AUKUS. You know, so these are issues that keep coming. And as you had a course in military diplomacy, there is there's a mix and match, because an element of military diplomacy works when you look at these issues. Like, for instance, if you, somebody, maybe Ramananda must have told you, I'm not sure, when you had this Malabar exercises, way back in 2007, it was a 5-country exercise, but then China had an issue with it, and then Australia went away. So the Malabar again became a bilateral exercise. And only now, again, after probably many years, more than a decade, Australia has come back. So these keep changing. So you need to understand this policy formulations, why they are taking place, the backdrop, the kind of geostrategic changes and the landscape that is changing in the world. So as a media practitioner, you need to keep yourself abreast with the developments happening all around in the globe, India's own stances on it. And if there's a change of stance, why is it changing? So if you try to understand that, you'll understand why the impact, the way in which foreign policy is being molded.
So, sir, before somebody takes up the questions, I have just a query to make to you. Sure. There was a complaint in the media long back that the country's foreign policy is run by Twitter, and the Prime Minister has stopped addressing press conferences, as it was done by his predecessors. They were having regular press conferences, and there was a time when the whole media team will accompany the Prime Minister on his tours abroad and all that. That was all, I think, discontinued. And every Prime Minister has his own way of doing things, and can decide what to do. And you know, there was complaint that we come to know about foreign policy decision through Twitter. And why the press conferences now, and recently some press conferences were held 1-to-1, and they also came into controversy and all that. So how do you look to at it? I mean, conduct of, this announcement of decisions through Twitter and all that, and particularly regarding foreign policy affairs and all.
I think it's not just foreign policy, sir. Over the, as I just mentioned, things have changed. As I said earlier, when you were an agency reporter, I was in PTI, we would get a call from somebody in a government and authority to inform us. And why was it so? Because we had the largest network of newspapers and news organizations who would subscribe to us. So in one go, it will reach to everybody, right? So the government decision would be communicated to everybody through this medium. Over the period of time, then came television. So people used to go and speak to television. Over a period of time, it's gone because now, once I'm clear, I have to tell something. I just put a tweet and release it. So everybody, all my followers get it. An authentic, official information from my handle is delivered, right? And whoever so wants to take it forward are free to take it forward. This has become an instant communication with not just the media, but everybody in the world. Whoever is following that particular handle will get to that. So, and that's the way nature. I can give you an instance. When I was in the US in 2007 and 8, the discourse that was happening is that time President Obama was a senator, and we used to see him on the Hill. Will he conduct his own policy through his large network of direct connect with people? Because the White House traditional system had yet to go, he didn't go there. So there was this whole discussion in papers. Will that change? Will he have the direct inputs? For instance, in America, it's very common as you go with a member of Congress, we get messages all the time on, in those days, there was no WhatsApp. So we used to get messages on the BlackBerry. Suppose Dr. Gore was the senator or Dr. Kaur was a member of Congress, and I am his staff, and there's an important bill coming on the floor. So his constituents would constantly tell us, tell Dr. Gore, vote this way, tell Dr. Gore, don't accept this position. You know, all the time, this constant information flow. So it was a job of the staff to kind of distill that and tell the congressman, listen, this is what your constituents are saying to you. That after that, it is his political call. How he has to do it is for him. So the world has changed ever since the social media has come on place. Now, every executive head has his own way of communicating to the people, whether he does through media and how media has to be, put to use. It's perfectly up to them. So I think that, but I don't think any policy nowadays, increasingly you've seen policy announcements are made through such social media networks. And earlier I said the press release would be come through a press call, through a fax, or later on through a telex machine and so on. Now with the days of communication changing, it's like, for instance, let's put it this way. India was evacuating, 4 planes have been stationed, right? So that message earlier, traditional format would have been, you communicate to a news agency, the news agency would flash the news, All India Radio, Doordarshan, or whatever radios would put it, repeat the announcement, and people listen and then go. But now it's available here, right? All the time on the networks. Authentic information is available. So the means and methods of delivery have changed. So people are using that for greater effect. So I think media has to and needs to keep inventing and reinventing itself as to what it can do in a situations like this. And quickly, you raised the question of the issue of media traveling with the Prime Minister. Of course, yes, it's not just Prime Minister, President of India and the Vice President of India. There was one thing which I don't know many people know, that except for the plane ticket, because the plane was going, the seats were there, irrespective. Everything else was paid by media. I have been on many trips. My company paid for my hotel, my lodging, my food, everything. So it is not that you are a state guest. You continue to pay, except that the plane was going, whether I sit in that plane or not. The plane has to go. There are X number of seats in a big plane. So you reconfigure accordingly. The rest of payments were made by the media organization. So I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding on this issue. And it helped, it also allowed you 2 things: to have interactions with members or policy makers on an informal understanding. And one important component, October, which I think it slipped my mind while talking, very important component that always happens in diplomatic and foreign policy is background briefings. A background briefing is a briefing where people of authority, people who are understanding or dealing with the subject, talk to you and tell you, look, this is what we are doing, or this is what's happening, and this is for your understanding. So when you write about this, you can use this information without attribution. And nowadays, if you notice, even America has, many other countries have this background briefings where the spokesperson or whoever is articulating a position says that this is for your understanding, it is non-attributable. So they are being upfront about that. So that means it's an understanding of a situation that you need to appreciate. The countries do it all the time. So this is a very important component to make you understand that, listen, we don't want to go public on it. We don't have it, but this you must appreciate. It just gives you a point of view. That's it.
Prasad Sahab, you had an opportunity of being in the US Congress and covering the debates, and you have been very active there. Compared to the debate on foreign affairs in Indian Parliament, do you think that sufficient time is given for discussion of foreign affairs or foreign policy matters in India compared to US and all?
No, because the very nature is different. Because in India, the foreign policy is decided by the government of the day, and only specific times are taken up for discussion. For instance, a very standard format has been when the demands for grants are taken up during budget. So if the ministry-related demands for grant come up for discussion, if suppose Lok Sabha is discussing demands for grant for Ministry of External Affairs, correspondingly, some other ministry will be taken up in Rajya Sabha, which doesn't have the power of the purse. So they discuss working of the ministry. So there are times when the working of the Ministry of External Affairs is taken up in Rajya Sabha. Then there are specific reports concerning various aspects of ministry, specific aspects of Ministry of External Affairs that come up for it. Then there are questions through which members of parliament elicit information from the government of the day. And those questions could be in the form of what is known as start questions. And when a start question is admitted and it comes up for, there are oral question and answers. So members get up and ask clarifications to the government of the day. The whole attempt is to see as much information as they can get from the government on various aspects of that particular question. In America, it's slightly different. As I mentioned, in America, every congressman, every senator has a certain role in foreign policy making. So they come up with that position. And as you know, in Senate has powers to appoint members. The president of America, when he appoints an ambassador to various countries and various organizations, it has to be ratified. And very recently, you must have seen the ratification process for the Indian ambassador designate to India, Eric Garcetti. And I just think today I had read a report that his ratification process has been put on hold. It's a process. The senators can do it. And when they put it on hold, that means they don't want to go at any process, and they have put a specific query on some allegation against the staff. So they want that to be clarified. So the whole process has been put on a hold. So their jurisdiction over foreign policy is different. For instance, in America, the president doesn't have the right to declare a war. It's the Congress. The Constitution doesn't allow them. So it has to be an authorization to use the military. And technically, US does not have a standing army. It is a continuing resolution which allows them to continue with the army. So these are differences. So I think that's there. That having been said, yes, still the number of discussions foreign policy are, I would say in the last 15 years, a couple of debates I just mentioned, where foreign policy has come up as a subject for members of parliament to discuss on the floor.
Yes, we can see the change now. Now, lastly, I would like to know about your assessment of the role of Consultative Committee of External Affairs Ministry in the formulation and how they, discuss issues, how they influence the decision making by the government on foreign affairs. Because
Yeah.
Shashi sir would have been very active as a chairman.
Sir, actually, consultative committees are members of parliament attached to, as you say, particular ministries. So they take up specific issues. There is periodic issues that they, in fact, they started in even in the Constituent Assembly, in the Legislative Assembly, Constituent Assembly Legislative. The consultative committee members would take up issues. In fact, if you read those debates, they are very interesting aspects. Some of the members used to question the government. You have taken this decision without informing us. You did not take permission from the consultative committee. You did not take sanction of the finance committee. You have bought a house in US and you have not taken financial sanctions. So these were the questions. And in fact, there are questions questioning India's external publicity division's work. Is it doing an effective work? Not doing effective work? All that formed backdrop to the making of a foreign policy. So these are important inputs for study. Part of it, which currently I'm engaging, is in that as to what is the intersect between the foreign policy of the country and the parliamentary interventions. In fact, that's one area I'm looking at very closely nowadays. I'm working on that project right now.
That's great to know. I mean, something very useful we can expect in the times to come.
Hope so. I mean, I'm looking at, just to share, I'm looking at three aspects, as I mentioned. One is the WTO debate.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the Indo-US nuclear deal.
Yeah.
And I'm also looking at the IPKF.
Yeah. So before we close the session, is there anyone with a question? Please be quick. We can't detain our guests for a long time.
I know, I think it's a Saturday evening. They probably want to sign off faster, right?
No. The problem is that you have explained everything in so detail. I mean, there's nothing to ask you further.
I did not include anecdotes because that would have only prolonged my lecture.
No. Actually, they are more useful. They are more useful because you say from your own personal experience. And this is something which is not available in the print media.
Yeah, what I told you.
Neither in the book nor in the autobiographies. I mean, they may cover all that.
I told you my discussions with Mr. Natwar Singh, or my discussions with Pranab Mukherjee sir. I just mentioned one instance.
Yeah.
Or, we had this informal conversations even when they were outside of parliament.
Yeah.
And they give you a lot of insights, whether it is foreign affairs ministers of different governments. So they give you a different insight, but they are sometimes linked to specific events. For instance, I'll just give you this has nothing to do with foreign policy per se, but there was a very interesting incident when Mr. Vajpayee was the Prime Minister in December 99, 23rd December 99, and that was the last day of Parliament. On the first floor, Vajpayee had come for some voting. So there was some committee voting. So he was voting and he was walking back. We saw some of us were standing nearby. We spotted him and we went to him and started talking to him and were walking back. And suddenly, as he kept walking, somebody asked a few questions here and there. And then suddenly he said, Vajpayee ji, 25 तारीख आ रहा है, आपका जन्मदिन है, तो घर पे नहीं बुलाएंगे चाय पिलाने के लिए. तो वाजपेयी जी थोड़ा दूर चले गए. He turned back. He says, पैदा तो होने दो. So, and unfortunately, 25th December 99 is remembered for something else, the IC 814.
Yeah.
So that the whole conversation changed and it became a. And instead, interesting, if you look at it, what somebody was mentioning, social media, the pressures that was created at that time on the government in terms of release the passengers, get them hostages released, is the relentless campaign that was showed across television channels of families protesting. So the government had to take a view, right? So in those days, there was no social media. It was only television and other newspapers reporting. But today, as I said, Ukraine manifests differently. So the governments have to take these into account at all the time. And
you have mentioned about Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He was an informal man. I mean, a gentleman, but an informal man. I will just take a minute. I had the privilege of meeting him on a number of occasions because he belonged to Gwalior and I was there in Gwalior. And he was a student of MA Political Science, and he studied in the same college in which I did my master's and all that. So besides that, when I was doing my doctoral thesis, I went to meet him just casually. He was on Firoz Shah Road, and I was working in ICWA library. So we walked down to his place, and we were surprised that there was just a simple constable sitting on the stool with a a small rod in his hand as a security. Now you can see the security paraphernalia
those things
outside the houses of the MPs. And then we went there and we asked that, can we meet Bajpayee? We have come from Gwalior. He said, no, if your name is in the list, then I will certainly send your message. Then we said, all right, we will come some other day. And but if you permit, you just send a slip with our names. Can you believe? The slip was sent inside that so and so people have come from Gwalior, and within 5 minutes, prior to the guest on the appointment list, we were called in, and we were ushered into the hall where he was seated. And then he asked me, "What are you doing here in Delhi?" I told him I'm working on my doctoral thesis. So he said, "What are your subjects?" I told him that I'm working on the state decorations under Indian Constitution, that is under Article 18, Bharat Ratna and all that. And that was the subject of my PhD thesis. And he just laughed. And he said, we have finished them. We said, there is no official notification, gazette notification. There is no news in the newspapers or on radio or television. No, he said that, yes, we have done it last night. Can you believe the cabinet decision was conveyed to me by nothing less than person like Bajpayee, that we had last night we had finished them during a cabinet meeting, and next day there was front page news in Times of India, and that these decorations have been abolished by the government and all. So I mean, he was such a gentleman and informed, and he said many things about these decorations. These are all political corruption and all that. So we decided, we opposed it when we were in a position. Then we thought that they should not be allowed to continue. So that way, he was a gentleman. I mean, very informal man. I never, he never spoke like a prime minister of India. He spoke like a gentleman to everyone. I mean, whether it is a head of the state or an ordinary citizen. So, sir, thank you very much for sharing your views on the role of media. And certainly, we have invited you to create certain cobwebs, because, every time we see the social media, particularly about this foreign policy affairs, we see all sorts of rubbish, because the people don't understand the complications of taking decisions in the field of foreign policy. They don't know how difficult it is for the government of the day to take decisions. They are very complicated issues and all that. So without realizing that, without understanding the issues, people write anything they like. So our objective is to remove this misunderstanding. Let us understand our foreign policy, Indian foreign policy. And that's why I always emphasize, I ask my students, first read as much as you can about and try to understand. And that's why we have invited you to make them understand what Indian foreign policy is, how it is formulated, how the role of media is important.
I hope I helped in a small way, sir. That's all. Yeah. I don't think I was elaborate. No. I'm not an academic.
No. But as a media person, you can just help remove these misunderstandings, which are there in the minds of the people at large. But being a university students, they should try to understand what actually are the realities. So
just before I conclude, I have one observation which I say all the time. Yeah. You see, today, whether it is Twitter or social media, this is nothing. I see it as an extension of our conversations in cafes and drawing rooms, where you say something without really understanding that is a larger implication, and without anything. Maybe some people understand. I'm not saying everybody is of the same genre, but a conversation between you in your drawing room, if that makes it to Twitter, will have a different implication. Or over a cafeteria, you and I may be discussing, we may be disagreeing on issues, or we may agree on issues, but doesn't mean what your agreement or disagreement is the policy. So
Yeah.
we need to understand those layers, and those layers, as you rightly said, come from reading, and there is no end to it.
Yes, thank you, sir. So, sir, thank you very much once again, and I'm very much thankful to you having spared time, because I know you were busy at 3 p.m. with some other live conference and all that. And,
Yeah, no, I was speaking to South African television on the Indian elections.
yeah. So that is the demand of the day.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, sir, and
Pleasure.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
With your permission, I close this session.
Thank you.